For Australia, imported oil is literally the lifeblood of our nation. After steadily cutting domestic oil production and refining, Australia is now more than 90% dependent on oil imports, mainly from the Middle East. And those imports could be under threat, with the terrorist group Al-Qaeda urging its followers to attack or sabotage oil supplies to Western countries, including Australia. The group has targeted what it calls maritime choke points, like the Malacca Straits, through which more than half of Australia's oil is shipped. So how real is the threat, and what are we doing to combat it? Matt Peacock reports.
Oil, fuel that drives the nation. It runs our cars, drives our trucks, delivers our food, fuels our factories and flies our aeroplanes. 15 years ago, Australia imported 60% of its oil from overseas. Now it's 91%, and that has some experts very worried.
If there's an interruption to the fuel supply chain coming in from overseas, after about a week we're going to run into serious problems. Without fuel, can't go to work, can't get to school, you can't get food.
Imagine if everybody lost 50% of their fuel, what would happen to industry? What would happen to agriculture? What would happen to defence? So this can mutate into a very serious issue for us.
More than half of Australia's fuel comes through the Straits of Hormuz to Singapore and then through the narrow Straits of Malacca, an area already notorious for its piracy. But now a new threat has emerged. In its new magazine Resurgence, Al-Qaeda has urged jihadists to target the Achilles heel of Western economies, and it identifies the choke points ripe for attack. Highlighting the oil routes to Australia, it comments that US naval presence has increased in this area under the Obama administration.
The chilling part of it was the words that they used of how vulnerable the global network of fuel supply is.
The National Roads and Motoring Association once just worried about roads and cars. Now it's also lobbying over fuel security.
They use words like geography has supplied the Mujahideen with a great opportunity. Now, you don't have to be a military specialist to work out what that might mean.
It's been pretty obvious for a long time that if terrorists wanted to really affect Western nations, they'd go for the blood supply, the fuel supply. I think that report, again, is another reminder to us the world has changed. We can't assume the way these supply chains have worked in the past is going to continue.
Not only has Australia's domestic oil production declined, but so too has the country's refining capacity, and with it, its ability to make specialist blends like aviation fuel locally. Something the former Deputy Chief of Australia's Air Force finds alarming.
We've got something like about 12-day stock holdings of diesel, according to BRE, and in some areas we believe stock holdings of other types of fuel could be as low as a week.
By next year, half of Australia's oil refineries will have shut down within the decade, with closures in Sydney, Brisbane and Adelaide. And another closure in Melbourne is on the cards. The industry says Australian plants simply can't compete with the huge modern mega refineries overseas.
They have changed the ball game for the Australian market. Their size and economies of scale have meant that they can refine fuel at a far more economic price than we can here in Australia.
The result, say critics, is that if Australia's shipping lines were suddenly disrupted, the effect could be catastrophic.
In Sydney, for example, in 1 week alone, there's about 45,000 truck trips just distributing food. You'd start to see the food run short in the shops probably within 3 to 4 days. You'd see the chemists start to run out of supplies after about 3 or 4 days. And our services we take for granted, electricity supply, water supply, none of this can happen without fuel for the supporting elements for those functions. So you'd start to see society collapse.
And all the security issues we're dealing with at the moment, you've got to think that there could be easily some interruptions. Now, I just think we need to be prepared for that. because the consequences of not being prepared would be horrendous.
But successive governments and industry have dismissed these concerns. In a statement today, Industry Minister Ian Macfarlane told 7:30,
"At any given time, Australia has crude oil and refined product on the way to Australia by diverse shipping routes. In the unlikely event that fuel supply is severely disrupted, the Australian government has powers to prioritise essential supply."
I look at how Australia has handled fuel supply interruptions in the past. We've seen multiple events internationally, Fukushima, GFC, local events such as Queensland cyclones, and in all those cases the industry has been able to provide fuel reliably and securely for customers.
Other countries like the US and EU nations have mandatory stockpiles of oil for just such an emergency, held in tanks or reservoirs. When Australia supplied more of its own oil, it entered an agreement with the International Energy Agency to hold a similar 90-day stockpile. But in recent years, it hasn't.
In the event that there is a threat, what do we do? In peacetime and when everything's going along nicely, there isn't a threat. But in the event that something does happen, what is the plan? How are we going to do it? Other countries in the world have mandated fuel stocks. We don't.
A recent government study estimated that a cost of $6.8 billion would be required to meet the infrastructure and supply requirements to meet the 90-day requirement. That cost has to be paid by someone, and in a transport fuel solution, in the end, the customer is going to pay for that.
Last year, Independent Senator John Madigan launched a parliamentary inquiry into the country's fuel security, which has yet to report. But Al-Qaeda's latest threat has increased the concerns of many.
When the proverbial hits the fan, you've got to have a plan in place or you're abdicating your responsibility to people and the nation as a whole.
If the government does nothing, we will eventually end up with no refineries in this country, 100% import dependency, the lowest stocks that make economic sense to the fuel companies, and our risk level will be higher. One day we'll have a crisis, we'll suddenly wake up, but unfortunately it'll be too late.